They said she carried bad luck like dust on her skin, and by sunrise, those same voices would fall quiet without a single shot fired. But no one in that town knew it yet. Not when the sun still hung low over the wooden roofs and the wind dragged heat across the empty street like a warning no one could hear. She stood at the edge of the well, hands still, eyes lowered, waiting in a silence that felt older than the town itself. And no one stepped forward, not the men leaning on the rail, not the women whispering behind gloved hands. Not even the boy who had been sent to fetch water but now stared at her like she didn't belong to the same world. Someone laughed, low and sharp, and the bucket rope creaked as it swung away from her reach, just enough to remind her where she stood in their eyes. Ethan Cole watched it all from the shade of the saloon porch, boot heel pressed against dry wood, hat tipped just low enough to hide the way his gaze stayed on her longer than it should. He had seen that look before, the kind that comes from being pushed outside of everything that once felt like ground beneath your feet, the kind that doesn't ask for help because it already knows the answer. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of leather and sunbaked dust, and still she didn't move, didn't argue, didn't beg, just stood there like she had already accepted something the rest of them didn't understand. Another voice rose, louder this time, telling her to leave, telling her this town had no place for her kind, and the words hung in the air longer than they should have. Heavy, certain, wrong. Ethan exhaled slow, like a man counting something only he could see, then stepped off the porch, each footfall quiet but deliberate, crossing the space no one else would cross. He didn't look at the others, didn't acknowledge the stares turning toward him, just walked straight to her side and reached for the rope, pulling the bucket up hand over hand until the water caught the light. Between them, for a moment, she didn't take it, her eyes lifting just enough to meet his, and there was no gratitude there, no relief, only a question sharpened by something deeper, something older than this place. He held the bucket steady anyway, like the answer didn't matter. The town went still in that strange way it does before something changes shape, before a line gets crossed that can't be drawn back again. You don't have to stand alone, he said, voice low, not loud enough to carry far, but it didn't need to, because the silence around them had already begun to listen. Somewhere behind them, a door creaked open, then shut just as fast, and the wind shifted again, colder this time, like the desert itself had turned its head. She studied him for one long second, then took the water, fingers brushing his just enough to make the moment real, and somewhere far beyond the ridge, where the land rolled into shadows and heat, something unseen had already begun to move toward them, slow, certain, inevitable, though no one in that town, not yet, understood what they had just set in motion. The bucket was empty before the sun reached its highest point, and still the town had not decided what to do with what they had just witnessed, because a line had been crossed in silence, and no one could quite name it without admitting something about themselves they were not ready to face. Ethan returned to the porch as if nothing had happened, resting his back against the same post, but the shade felt thinner now, like the heat had followed him there on purpose. Across the street, she moved without hurry, carrying the water as if she had done it 1,000 times before, though every step she took seemed to echo louder than it should, drawing eyes that quickly looked away when she turned. They called her Naeli when they thought she could not hear, a name spoken like it carried a warning, like it meant something had gone wrong long before she ever reached their town. No one could agree on the story, only on the ending, that she did not belong, that she had brought something with her that did not fit between wooden walls and narrow minds. The barber swore he had seen her near the ridge at dusk, standing alone, speaking to no one, while the wind bent around her like it knew her name. The woman who ran the boarding house claimed her presence made the lamps flicker, though the oil was fresh and the glass was clean. Even the sheriff, a man who preferred simple explanations, had started watching the horizon more often than the streets. But Ethan did not listen to any of it, not because he believed none of it, but because he had learned long ago that stories told by crowds rarely belonged to the truth. Late in the afternoon, when the shadows stretched long and thin across the dirt, he found her again at the edge of town, where the land began to open into dry grass and scattered stone, a place where fences ended and nothing held you in place but your own choice to stay. She stood with her back to him, the wind pulling gently at her hair, carrying the faint scent of smoke and sage that did not belong to anything nearby. He stopped a few feet away, far enough to leave space, close enough to be heard without raising his voice. "You should not have done that," she said before he could speak, her words steady, not angry, not grateful, just certain in a way that made the air feel heavier. Ethan glanced toward the town behind them, then back to her, the sun catching in his eyes as he answered. Seemed like it needed doing. And for a moment, that was all there was. Two people standing between a place that rejected one of them and a horizon that promised nothing to either. She turned then, slowly, studying him like she was measuring something that could not be seen, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something different, not warning, not fear, but wait. "You think this ends with water and silence," she said, and the wind shifted again, colder than it should have been for that time of day. "But you do not know what it means to stand where you just stood." And Ethan did not look away, did not step back, only met her gaze with the same quiet steadiness he had shown at the well, as if whatever came next had already been decided somewhere neither of them could see. Far beyond the ridge, a line of dust had begun to rise, too distant to notice, too deliberate to be chance, and the land itself seemed to hold its breath as if it understood something the town did not. The dust on the horizon did not belong to cattle or traders. It moved too steady, too measured, like something that knew exactly where it was going. And though the town had not yet seen it, something in the air had already begun to change, the kind of change that settles into the bones before it ever reaches the eyes. Ethan remained where he stood a moment longer, watching Nayeli as she turned back toward the open land, her steps unhurried, as if time did not press on her the same way it did on everyone else, and that alone should have been enough to tell him this was no ordinary crossing of paths. "Then tell me," he said quietly, not raising his voice, not chasing after her, just letting the words fall between them. "What does it mean?" And she stopped, not fully turning, just enough that he could see the line of her jaw tighten slightly, as if the answer carried weight she had no interest in sharing. "It means," she said after a long second, "you have stepped into something that does not bend for men like you." And there was no anger in it, no threat, only certainty, the kind that made arguing feel like a waste of breath. Ethan let out a slow breath, glancing once more toward the town, where figures still moved in small clusters, pretending nothing had shifted, pretending the world remained as simple as it had been that morning. "I have never been much for bending," he replied, and for the first time, something flickered in her expression. Not quite surprise, not quite approval, something in between. That disappeared as quickly as it came. The wind picked up again, carrying a faint sound that did not belong to the usual rhythm of the land, distant, almost mistaken for thunder, but too even, too deliberate. And Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked past her toward the ridge, though from where he stood, there was nothing yet to see. Nayeli followed his gaze for only a moment before turning back, her voice lower now, almost lost beneath the shifting air. "You should leave before night," she said, and this time there was something else beneath the words, something closer to warning than before. Ethan shook his head once, slow, as if the decision had already been made long before this moment. "Not leaving you here," he said, simple, direct, and the kind of statement that did not ask permission. She studied him again, longer this time, as if searching for something that would make him step back, something that would place him back where he belonged in the order of things. But whatever she was looking for, she did not find it. Instead, she reached beneath the edge of her worn shawl and pulled free a small object, a narrow strip of leather bound around a piece of turquoise stone, worn smooth with time, and held it in her hand without offering it, without explaining it, just letting it catch the fading light between them. Ethan's eyes dropped to it for a fraction of a second before lifting back to her face. And though he said nothing, something in his stillness shifted, like a memory brushing against the edge of recognition. "This is why they fear," she said, her voice steady again. "Not because they understand, but because they do not." And she closed her fingers around the stone, hiding it from view as if the act itself mattered more than the object. The sound in the distance grew just slightly louder, still far, still unseen, but no longer easy to ignore, and the wind that carried it now felt colder against the skin, like the first hint of a storm that had already decided to arrive. Ethan adjusted his stance, not reaching for anything, not preparing in any visible way, just grounding himself in place as he looked once more toward the ridge, and this time, if only for a second, a thin line of movement broke the horizon, too small to name, too precise to dismiss, and whatever came with it was already closer than the town would have ever believed. The line on the horizon grew clearer with every passing minute, no longer a trick of light or heat, but riders, steady and silent, cutting across the land like a thought that had already been decided long before it reached the town. And still, the people carried on as if nothing had changed, doors opening and closing, voices low, eyes glancing but never holding for too long. Ethan did not move from where he stood, his gaze fixed on that distant motion, while beside him Naeli remained just as still, though the wind now pulled harder at the edges of her shawl, revealing and hiding that same small piece of turquoise as if it carried a rhythm of its own. "They are coming," she said, not as a warning this time, but as a fact that needed no explanation, and Ethan nodded once, slow, as if he had already known, as if the land itself had told him before his eyes ever confirmed it. Behind them, the town began to notice, not all at once, but in fragments, a man pausing mid-step, a woman shading her eyes, the sheriff stepping out from his office with a look that did not belong to someone who believed in coincidences. The sound reached them next, faint at first, then clearer, the steady beat of hooves carried across dry earth, not rushed, not scattered, but unified in a way that made the air feel tighter with every second. Someone spoke a name under their breath, not loud enough to be heard, but heavy enough to spread. And suddenly the town that had stood so certain that morning now felt unsure of where to stand at all. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not preparing to leave, not preparing to fight, just grounding himself in the space he had chosen, and that choice alone seemed to draw more attention than anything else. Naeli turned to him then, fully this time, her eyes holding his with a steadiness that did not ask, did not plead, only measured, and in that moment, the distance between them felt smaller than the space between the town and the ridge. "You still have time," she said quietly, though there was no urgency in it. No push, just an offering that felt more like a test than a warning. Ethan glanced past her once more, the riders now distinct shapes against the fading light, then back to her, and shook his head, not sharp, not defiant, just final. "I made my choice," he said, and the words settled between them like something solid, something that could not be taken back once placed. The wind stilled for a brief moment, as if the land itself had paused to listen, and in that silence, Ethan reached for her hand, not fast, not hesitant, just steady, fingers closing around hers in a way that carried no claim, no force, only presence. For a heartbeat, she did not react, her gaze searching his face as if expecting something else to follow, something louder, something more. But when nothing came, when he simply stood there, unmoving, something in her expression shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like a door that had been closed for a long time opening just enough to let light through. The first riders crested the ridge then, silhouettes against the sky, and the town fell completely silent. Not because they had chosen to, but because something larger than them had taken the sound away. Ethan did not look at them right away, did not turn, did not release her hand. And for the first time since she had stepped into that town, Naeli did not stand alone. The first row of riders came down the ridge without a single shout, without a single raised hand, their horses moving in a slow, deliberate line that spoke of control rather than threat. And that was what unsettled the town most. Not what they did, but what they did not do. Ethan finally turned his head, just enough to watch them approach, his grip on Naeli's hand unchanged, steady as before, while the dust settled around their boots like it had nowhere else to go. The sheriff stepped forward into the street, one cautious step at a time, his eyes scanning the line of riders as if searching for something familiar, something he could understand. But there was nothing in their stillness that fit into the rules he had built his life on. "Stay where you are," he called out, his voice firm but thinner than he intended, carried away slightly by the wind before it could land with any weight. The riders did not respond, not with words, not with movement, only continued forward until the space between them and the town narrowed to something that could no longer be ignored. Doors closed quietly behind drawn curtains, boots shuffled against wooden floors, and the same voices that had spoken so loudly that morning now found no place to stand. Naeli's fingers remained still, in Ethan's grasp, neither tightening nor pulling away, as if she had already accepted everything that was unfolding, and that acceptance carried a calm that did not match the tension gathering around them. "They are not here for you," she said under her breath, so low it barely reached him, and yet it carried more certainty than anything spoken since the riders appeared. Ethan did not ask what she meant, did not question it, only stood his ground as the lead rider finally broke from the line, guiding his horse forward with a slow, measured pace that drew every eye in the town toward him. The man sat tall in the saddle, his presence quiet but unmistakable, the kind that did not need to be announced to be understood. And though his face showed no sign of anger or urgency, there was something in the way the others held back that made it clear he carried a weight none of them shared. The horse came to a stop several yards away, close enough to be heard, far enough to keep the space intact, and for a long moment, nothing was said, nothing moved. The air itself held between one breath and the next. Ethan met the man's gaze without shifting, without lowering his own, not in challenge, not in defiance, simply as one man acknowledging another. And that small act seemed to ripple outward in a way no one in the town could quite explain. The sheriff cleared his throat, stepping forward again as if to reclaim something slipping from his grasp. But the words he had prepared did not come, not when the rider's attention shifted, not toward him, but past him, settling instead on the figure standing beside Ethan. Naeli did not step forward, did not speak, only stood there as she had from the beginning, quiet, steady, as if the ground beneath her belonged to something older than the town itself. The wind lifted once more, carrying the scent of dust and distant sage, and in that moment, the entire street seemed to hold still, waiting for something no one had the language to name. The riders slowly dismounted, boots touching the ground without a sound that anyone could remember hearing, and though no weapon was drawn, no command was given, the weight of his presence alone was enough to press against every wall, every door, every breath in that place. Ethan felt it, the shift, the moment where everything balanced on a single point, and still he did not let go, did not step back, only remained where he had chosen to stand, because somewhere deep beneath the fear and the silence, he understood one thing clearly. This had never been about the town, and it had never been about him. The man who had stepped from the horse did not speak right away, and somehow that silence carried more weight than any command could have, because it was not empty, it was deliberate, chosen, and it settled over the town like a shadow that did not belong to the sun. His eyes remained on Naeli, not searching, not questioning, but recognizing, as if he had known exactly where to look long before he ever arrived. And that alone was enough to make the sheriff take a slow step back, without realizing he had moved at all. Ethan felt the shift beside him, not in her hand, which stayed steady in his, but in the air around her, like something unseen had finally reached the place it was always meant to stand. The man inclined his head just slightly, not a bow, not yet, but enough to carry meaning. And the riders behind him remained still, their horses quiet, their presence unbroken by a single restless movement. "You came," Naeli said, her voice calm, carrying no surprise, only the quiet acknowledgement of something expected, and the man answered with the same stillness in his tone. "You knew we would." His words low, measured, spoken not for the town, not for Ethan, but for her alone. The sheriff found his voice then, though it came slower than before, uncertain in a way that had not been there that morning. "State your business," he said, the words hanging in the air like they had been borrowed from another time, another place where they still held authority. The man did not look at him, did not answer, and that absence of response seemed to strip the question of its purpose entirely, leaving it to fall between them without landing anywhere. Ethan shifted his gaze from the man back to Naeli, watching her closely now, the pieces beginning to settle into a shape he had not yet fully understood, but one that felt larger than anything the town had imagined. "You should not have stayed," she said softly, though there was no regret in it, no apology, just a statement shaped by Something deeper than circumstance. Ethan gave a faint shake of his head, the smallest motion. But enough? I told you, he replied, and there was nothing more to add to that, nothing that needed to be said again. The man's eyes moved then, finally, lifting from Nayeli to Ethan, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single exchange, not hostile, not welcoming, simply measuring, as if weighing something that could not be seen with the eye alone. The wind stirred once more, carrying the faint sound of leather and distant earth, and in that moment, the man stepped forward one pace, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance of the space between them. He raised his hand, not toward Ethan, not toward the town, but toward Nayeli, palm open, a gesture that held no demand, only recognition, and for the first time since the riders had arrived, a ripple moved through those who watched, a quiet unease that came from realizing they were witnessing something they did not understand. Nayeli released Ethan's hand then, not abruptly, not with hesitation, but with a calm that made the absence of contact feel like part of the same motion that had brought them together, and she stepped forward to meet the man, her movement steady, unhurried, as if the ground itself guided her steps. Ethan remained where he was, watching, not reaching out, not calling her back, because somewhere in the stillness of that moment, he understood that whatever stood before him now had never been his to hold, only his to stand beside. The town held its breath as the distance between Nayeli and the man closed, and just before she reached him, just before anything could be spoken that might break the silence, the man lowered himself, slow, deliberate, down onto one knee, and in that single motion, the entire meaning of everything that had come before began to unravel in a way none of them had been prepared to see. The moment his knee touched the ground, the world shifted in a way no one in that town could deny, because men like him did not kneel, not to strangers, not to outcasts, not to anyone they did not answer to, and yet there he was, head lowered, posture steady, offering a respect that carried more meaning than any word ever spoken in that street. A quiet ripple moved through the riders behind him, not disorder, not surprise, but alignment, as if one motion had given shape to all the others, and one by one, without a sound, they followed, lowering themselves in the dust until the line that had once looked like a storm now resembled something else entirely, something solemn, something intentional. The town did not understand it, could not place it, within the narrow boundaries it had built for itself, and so it stood frozen, eyes wide, voices gone. The same people who had turned away from her now unable to look anywhere else. Ethan felt it in his chest, not fear, not confusion, but the unmistakable weight of truth arriving without warning, the kind that does not ask permission before it changes everything. Nayeli stood before the kneeling man, her expression unreadable, her shoulders still, as if this moment had been waiting for her long before she ever stepped into that town. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried across the silence with a quiet authority that did not need to rise to be heard. "You should not have followed me," she said, and though the words might have sounded like reproach to others, there was something beneath them, something closer to understanding than refusal. The man lifted his gaze then, not fully, not enough to break the gesture, but enough to meet her eyes, and when he answered, his voice held the same calm certainty that had marked every movement since his arrival. "We do not leave our own to stand alone." And the words settled over the town like something ancient, something that had been spoken long before these wooden walls were ever raised. Ethan watched the exchange without moving, his hands resting at his sides now. The space where hers had been still warm with the memory of contact, and for the first time, he understood that the stories the town had whispered were not just wrong. They had been built to hide something they could not comprehend. Nayeli glanced back at him then, just for a moment, and in that brief look, there was no warning, no distance, only a quiet recognition of the choice he had made, and the cost it carried, though neither of them spoke it aloud. The sheriff shifted again, uncertainty finally breaking through whatever authority he had been holding on to. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, though the question no longer sounded like control, only confusion, and this time, the kneeling man answered, rising slowly to his feet, not rushed, not defensive, simply returning to his full height with a presence that filled the space without force. "You cast judgment on what you did not understand," he said, his gaze moving briefly across the town before returning to Nayeli. And you mistook silence for weakness. The words were not loud, not sharp, but they carried, each one landing with a clarity that left no room for denial. A faint wind passed through the street, lifting dust around their boots, and in that moment, the man reached into the fold of his garment and drew out a small object, wrapped in worn cloth, holding it carefully, not as something to display, but as something to return. He stepped forward one pace, extending it toward Nayeli, and though no one in the town knew what it was, they felt its importance in the way he held it, in the way the riders remained still, in the way the air itself seemed to tighten around that single motion. Nayeli did not take it immediately, her eyes resting on the bundle as if it carried more than what could be seen. And when she finally reached for it, her fingers steady, her breath calm, the silence deepened, stretching just a little further, as if the land itself was waiting to see what she would do next. The cloth felt heavier than it should have as Nayeli took it into her hands, not because of what it weighed, but because of what it carried. And for a moment she did not move, did not speak, only stood there with the entire town watching, as if the answer to everything they did not understand rested inside that small, worn bundle. The wind settled low against the ground, curling dust around her feet, and slowly, with a care that turned the act into something almost sacred, she unfolded the cloth, revealing what lay within, a second piece of turquoise, larger than the one she wore, set in old silver that had been shaped by hands long gone, its surface marked with lines that told a story no one in that town could read. A faint murmur passed through the riders, not loud, not breaking the silence, but enough to signal that something important had been returned to its place, and the man who had brought it lowered his head again, not in submission, but in recognition of what now stood before him. Nayeli lifted the piece slightly, the light catching along its edges, and, for the first time since she had entered the town, something shifted in her posture, not rising, not changing, but settling into itself as if a part of her that had been held back had finally been allowed to exist openly. She closed her fingers around it and looked out across the street, not at Ethan first, not at the riders, but at the people who had turned their backs on her. And though she said nothing for a long moment, the silence carried more weight than anything she could have spoken. "You believed I was cast out," she said at last, her voice calm, steady, but now carrying something deeper, something rooted far beyond the reach of the town, because it made your world easier to hold together. The words did not accuse, did not rise in anger. They simply revealed, and in that revelation, the truth landed heavier than any judgment ever had. The sheriff shifted again, his certainty gone, replaced by something closer to unease. "Then what are you?" he asked, though the question came out quieter than he intended, as if he already knew he would not like the answer. Nayeli turned her gaze back to him, not harsh, not forgiving, just clear. "I am the one who left so that others would not have to," she said, and the meaning of it moved through the street like a slow wind, touching each person in a different way. "I carried your fear so it would not reach my people," she added, her hand tightening slightly around the turquoise, "and I carried their silence so it would not reach you." The words hung there, bridging a space no one had ever tried to cross. Ethan felt it then, the full shape of what she had done, not just for her own people, but for the town that had never deserved it. And he did not move, did not speak, because there was nothing he could add that would not diminish the weight of what had already been said. The man beside her stepped forward again, not interrupting, not taking the moment from her, only standing close enough to be heard when he spoke. "She was never cast out," he said, his voice carrying across the street with quiet certainty. "She chose to walk alone so that neither side would have to face what they feared, and the truth of that settled into the bones of the town, leaving no space for the stories they had told themselves." Nayeli lowered her gaze briefly, not in shame, not in doubt, but in something quieter, something closer to acceptance, then turned slightly, her eyes finding Ethan at last, and in that look, there was no distance left, no warning, only the quiet acknowledgement that the choice he had made had brought him into something far larger than either of them had spoken aloud. The turquoise rested in her palm, catching the last light of day, and though no one said it, everyone understood that whatever came next would not be decided by fear, But by her the last light of the day rested on the edge of the rooftops as the town stood in a silence that no one dared to break, not after hearing what had been revealed, not after realizing that the woman they had turned away had been carrying something far heavier than any of them had ever been asked to bear. Nayeli let the second turquoise rest in her palm for a moment longer before closing her fingers around it. The two pieces now joined not just by silver and stone, but by something older, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The man beside her stepped back without a word, giving her the space that had always belonged to her, and the riders behind him remained still, waiting, not for a command, but for a choice. Ethan did not move from where he stood, though the weight of everything that had unfolded pressed against him like the heat of the desert at noon, steady, undeniable, and yet he held his ground the same way he had from the beginning, not because he knew what would come next, but because he had already chosen where he belonged. Nayeli looked across the town one final time, her gaze passing over faces that now held something different, not understanding, not yet, but something quieter, something closer to the beginning of it. And she could have spoken then, could have said something to ease the distance, to mend what had been broken, but she did not, because some things were not meant to be repaired with words. Instead, she turned, slowly, deliberately, until she faced Ethan fully, the fading light catching in her eyes. And for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fall away, leaving only the space between them. "You knew nothing," she said, her voice calm, without accusation, without regret, and still you stood. And the truth of that settled between them like something that did not need to be questioned. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation, the same quiet steadiness that had carried him this far still present. "Seemed like the right place to stand," he replied, and there was no attempt to make it more than that, no effort to explain or justify, only the simple honesty that had guided him from the start. Something in her expression softened then, not in a way the town could see, not in a way that changed her posture, but in a way that mattered, in a way that shifted the space between them from distance to something closer, something shared. She stepped toward him, not as someone seeking shelter, not as someone asking permission, but as someone who had made her own decision. And when she reached his side, she did not take his hand this time. She simply stood there, equal, present, no longer alone and no longer apart. Behind them, the man who had knelt earlier lifted his hand once, a quiet signal, and the riders began to rise, not in haste, not in formation for anything the town might fear, but in a calm, measured motion that carried no threat, only closure. One by one, they turned their horses back toward the ridge, the same path they had come, leaving no mark beyond the faint trace of hoofprints in the dust. The town watched as they disappeared into the fading light, the silence they left behind heavier than the one they had arrived with. Because this time, it carried understanding, or at least the beginning of it. The sheriff lowered his gaze. The others followed, not out of fear, but out of something they could not quite name, something that felt like the first step towards seeing what they had refused to see before. Ethan remained where he stood, the wind brushing lightly against his coat, and beside him, Nayeli did the same. The two of them facing the empty horizon where the riders had vanished, and though nothing had been promised, nothing had been declared, something had changed all the same. The town would remember this day, not for what had been taken, but for what had been revealed, and long after the dust had settled and the stories began to form again, one truth would remain. Out here, justice did not arrive with noise or force. It arrived quietly, in the space between two people who chose to stand where others would not. And sometimes, that was enough.